And what has happened over time is that international banks and export credit agencies have increasingly grown comfortable with the role that SIDF plays, because what they typically do is that once they have taken over a certain amount of the financing, their maximum loans which they can extend is about $500 million in total, which may be small within the context of the mega projects that we are looking at financing. However, what it does is that SIDF consents to provide the other commercial lenders with the residual proceeds in the event of an enforcement. So in a very, very sort of an indirect fashion, by having an SIDF financings, commercial lenders gain access to a security which they would traditionally not have had. Now, just looking at the SIDF track record, as I had mentioned before, if you actually look at it, there is a lot of sort of linkages with energy, whether it's through chemical industries or cement industries and other building materials. This just gives you a sort of a snapshot in terms of its total cumulative commitments since 1974. In terms of 2009, again, as you can see, it is the same industries which have remained the traditional sort of the traditional users of SIDF financings. Now, if you look at the sort of advantages and key considerations of development financial institutions, one of the things that you will obviously look at is the fact that being a government institute, there is a lot of due diligence which needs to be undertaken. And it's a relatively long process. It's a very complex due diligence. And in some ways, what happens is that once SIDF does grant a financing, and this can be even in the form of guarantees, what it does for the banking sector as a whole, or even for other banks which may not have the time or the sort of an aptitude, especially the smaller banks, in terms of doing the due diligence, they are at least assured that there has been a very, very complex sort of an analysis which has been done. SIDF typically requires that they go and actually visit the manufacturer sites. They actually go and do a due diligence in terms of the off-taker. And they have technical teams in place which provide advice to, especially to the smaller projects. SIDF participation typically brings in a much, much larger entity, which is the Public Investment Fund. We'll be talking a little more about that shortly. What you actually have over a period of time is that SIDF has adapted its policies so that it is fairly in consonance with co-funding by commercial banks. In other words, they have a sort of an intercreditor process which effectively allows them the same rights from a voting perspective. This has been something which has actually evolved over the last 5-10 years, and it's very interesting because whilst SIDF as a development financial institute would fund projects on a standalone basis, increasingly they are now co-funding along with other export credit agencies and international banks. Now, as I had alluded to earlier, Public Investment Fund is effectively an arm of the government of Saudi Arabia, but unlike sort of a government allocation for a specific project, this is a standalone entity which has both an equity as well as a debt mandate. In the case of PIF, it is very clear in terms of its objectives that whilst the overriding factor is that a project that it invests in, whether it's on the equity or the debt side, has to be commercially viable, PIF also very clearly looks at the strategic significance of a particular project or any financing that it does from a national perspective. And in certain instances, and I'll give you a case study about that, PIF has effectively stepped in to projects which for one reason or the other would have been delayed. If you actually look at PIF and SIDF, if there is a very large project, there is about $2 billion approximately, which can essentially be insured from an indigenous or from local perspectives, not taking into account the capacity of the Saudi bank market. If you look at, just as a digression, the Saudi bank market, I mean, there is effectively liquidity available for projects within Saudi Arabia of another $1.5 billion to $2 billion on a take-and-hold basis. So if you actually look at projects, up to $4 billion can be financed internally, and it's only beyond that point you start having to look at international banks, export credit agencies, and increasingly now project bonds.